All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Rick, moderating the panel. We have very little time and a lot to cover, so I'm just going to jump right into it. There's not going to be any intros or anything. Everyone's just going to talk. I think the first question that we want to ask is, what is Eth2? And I'm just going to let the panel sort of decide who wants to answer that first. Okay, I'll start picking people. Mamy, you want to go?
So Eth2 will be the next an evolution of the Ethereum 1 network. It won't be compatible, but you will be able to move your Ethereum on Eth1 to Ethereum 2. And the main goal of Eth2 is increase the scalability, because that's one of the main concern over Eth1. And also we will change from proof of work consensus algorithm to proof of stake, which promises also much less energy consumption.
Thanks. Alex, would you like to sort of talk about what some of the specific features of Eth2 are, like the beacon chains?
Sure, yeah. So the first thing to realize about Eth2 is that we're taking like a phased approach. The reason we're doing this is essentially to kind of be more conservative in like the rollout, because it is like this whole new sharded blockchain, this whole big system. So there's phase 0, phase 1, and phase 2 that you'll hear a lot about. And again, these are different stages of the system. So we have phase 0, which is the deployment of an entirely new blockchain called the beacon chain. In phase 1, we then have, let's say, 1,024 shards that just have data in them. And then with phase 2, we layer execution semantics on top of these shards. So now we have like the Ethereum system today, but now with 1,000 more throughput, something like that.
Thanks. Would you like to talk about some of the challenges in implementing the phased approach and like where your team is in implementation? And
I think at this moment, most of the team has already finished the state transition and consensus part. I think all of us are kind of working on the networking, the wire protocol, including the networking. We are using the Lab P2P and also the discovery protocol, which might take some time. But in September, we will have a gathering of most of the teams to gather together in one place, and we will have like an inter-op meeting to get all the clients talk with each other.
It's cool. It's cool. There's 4 of you on the panel right now, and there are 9 teams that are officially working to build Eth2. Would any of you like to sort of describe why it is that so many teams are working on the project?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is mainly just that there's, you didn't have to ask anyone's permission to start. Definitely, we are taking a multi-client approach to the network, right? So instead of having one implementation, we want more than one. Like today on Ethereum, there's 2 to 3, sort of ones in heavy use. In Eth2, we'd want something similar, maybe a few more, right? And this is just in the case that if there's a bug in one implementation, it doesn't necessarily cause like a network-wide fault.
Yeah, the different teams also have different specialities, right? So different clients are targeting different particular use cases. So people are targeting large businesses. I think Nimbus is targeting small applications.
Small devices, mobile phones, Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, we're targeting security and optimizations, speed.
Yeah, and would you like to talk a little bit about your usage of like libp2p and why we've transitioned from dev P2P, which is the P2P stack in Ethereum today, to a more, I guess, well, you'll explain why you switched.
Sure. So with Ethereum 2, we opted to go with libp2p. libp2p is for those of you that don't know, is a modular networking stack. So it allows us to modularly swap different transports, protocols, security layers on top of that. So with Ethereum 2, we had to decide on specifically which protocols and stuff that we need. And yeah, I guess mainly it's modular, up to date, state of the art.
Yeah. So the modularity is a main point, and also I guess one of the benefits of that is that we're still developing the spec, we're still developing the protocol, so it may be faster to prototype if you're not starting completely from scratch, but you're starting from a modular system where you can implement those changes.
Yeah, so libp2p gives you the framework, so it gives you some of these base layers, like the transport. So we can use TCP, we can use TCP. We can't use UDP over the other things, but we're going to start with TCP, but we can swap out different transports at a lower layer. We've decided and we've negotiated exactly what protocols we're going to use. We're using Gossip Sub. We've developed our own RPC, and we've kind of locked this in, at least for the initial interop phase, the testing. Yeah, so we've worked out exactly what we're going to do. We're in the process of building it.
And then at a higher level, like what happens is, as you know, all of our client teams are working on the P2P. There's protocol labs and Filecoin focused on the P2P. As all these people across the sort of decentralized community put these efforts into developing this really robust, solid, shared networking stack, we can all take part in the gains there.
Yeah. And another thing is that for Ethereum 2, the teams and the EF notably is also involving into other communities. So libp2p is not only Ethereum, it's also Filecoin, but we can also see that on cryptography, where the Ethereum is leading an effort to standardize signatures across many blockchains like Definity, what else? Chia network, and about 2 or 3 others.
Yeah. I think maybe Solana. There's this whole like VDF effort.
Yeah. The VDF effort is really, I think VDFs are great and not really the topic of this talk, but I'm glad to see that the community is like working together to make those available as quickly as possible, because they're really transformative in how we can do sort of alternatives to proof of work. Does someone want to talk about exactly why the beacon chain isn't just the mainnet existing Ethereum 1 chain? Like, why do we have Beth and why do we have the beacon chain?
Essentially, it's what I said a minute ago, that we want to take sort of a conservative approach to this. In some sense, we've decided that we need to make a faster Ethereum. The Ethereum today won't meet sort of the use cases and needs we think we need, right? So an easy way to do that is kind of just to start from scratch. That means then that you don't want to suddenly have everyone on day one on some new proof of stake blockchain that has never been deployed at this scale and this type of thing. So again, you have this phased deployment to conservatively be like, okay, here's beacon chain mainnet. If something terrible were to happen, we could imagine starting another mainnet. And then all this is happening in parallel to Ethereum today. So again, if anything like this happens, it's not going to disrupt the stuff that we're all doing today. Yeah.
So Lee, I know you work on Parity Ethereum as well. Do you see maybe an opportunity to seamlessly migrate from the ETH1 client to the ETH2 client?
Yeah, I think that's. First of all, we won't it's kind of very difficult to build the ETH2 client directly on ETH1 client. But what we will do is to I think this is what all the teams are doing, is to create a really seamlessly upgrade path, for example, to have a binary that combines both an ETH1 client and an ETH2 client, so that it's more easier for validator to use, stuff like that. So I think ultimately the ETH1 is probably going to exist for at least several more years. But what we want to have is eventually to get all the state from ETH1 migrated onto ETH2 by possibly making the ETH1 into a shard of ETH2.
Yeah, cool. And so, Mamy, would you like to talk about execution environments and how they would help with what we just described?
Yes. So execution environment is part of phase 2. And that's the part that will execute smart contracts and also, for example, transfers. the spec for execution environment has been changed a lot in the past month. At first, we were supposed to have something specific to Ethereum 2, but it seems like we are heading towards multiple execution environments. So one could be, for example, the EVM, which would allow running Ethereum 1 like code on Ethereum 2. We could have also EWASM, but we might also have execution environment very specific to certain types of application that would be very efficient. For example, just transfers, or maybe something for games. So it's still a bit fuzzy into what people will be able to do. But we encourage everyone to come talk on the Ethereum Research Forum and tell what they want to see and build on.
Cool. Adrian, are there any misconceptions you think there are around ETH2 that are worth discussing, or questions that you commonly get that?
Yeah, sure. So I guess a lot of the questions is when it's going to come out and what's going to be ready when it does come out. Yeah, so I'll probably just quickly touch on that. As Alex was saying, that it's staged into phases. The first phase is a very big milestone, and in that phase, you can't actually process. There's no execution environments, as Mamy was talking about, so you can't actually do any processors or smart contracts or anything like that. So when phase 0 does actually get released, which is supposed to be early next year, you still can't actually do anything. So I would imagine that that's one misconception, that when we first release phase 0, then we're going to have a faster, scalable Ethereum. That's not actually the case. We need phase 1 and phase 2 for that to happen.
And I'll add a misconception to the misconception, which is that we actually get something tangible for Ethereum today out of each phase. So for example, with the beacon chain, we can actually use the Casper finality to start finalizing the proof of work chain. In phase 1, we can actually use that as sort of this data layer to scale, again, Ethereum today. And then by the time phase 2 is here, yeah, we'll do something like fork Ethereum into an EE, and everything's great.
I think that's actually, I mean, that's news to me. So I'm glad to hear that that you're working to provide some value each step of the way. And I think that also, from my sort of wearing my systems hat, I think that there's an interesting challenge there because of it's so hard to develop a client given the existing client. And so to provide these benefits in a way where miners and end users and dApp developers can really take advantage of them, that's going to be an interesting challenge, because I think one of the things that happens in the blockchain space is when you're developing a normal dApp, or I'm sorry, a normal application, the relationship between the software provider and the user is very explicit and very clear. In the blockchain space, there's all this extra coordination that needs to happen that I think really slows down projects compared to their centralized brethren. And so I'm actually pretty excited to see how we address, how we're going to provide these benefits to the end users as they're being released, and then also trying to synchronize that. I mean, we were talking prior, synchronize that with the hard forks that happen in Ethereum 1, which is in its own right a complicated process, an extremely complicated process.
Right. So like, yeah, another example there would be like the sort of UX around cross-shard transactions, which I know a lot of people are, there's a lot of questions about that. So yeah, totally. It's really complex stuff happening on both sides, and it's this really huge coordination problem.
Cool. Well, we have about 6 minutes left, actually. So I don't know if the audience wants to ask a question. I'm pretty brutal, but I'm happy to, if it's a good question, I won't shoot it down. Anyone? Just yell.
So my question is regarding the beacon chain, specifically for Alex. What are the main things that, can anyone just join and become a validator to run a shard? What is required? Is it centralized in the Ethereum Foundation?
Sure. So the question was essentially around becoming a validator in the beacon chain in this phase 0. So yeah, how does that work? So when we have phase 0, the beacon chain, mainnet, right, there'll be a number of validators in the system. They'll be the ones building this chain. And again, in the context of the whole sharded thing, the beacon chain is this like central coordination chain to kind of coordinate, again, all these efforts across the system. Either way, to become a validator, there's basically going to be a smart contract deployed sometime soon on the Ethereum chain today, the proof of work chain. And the idea there is that if you want to become a validator on the new system, you submit 32 ETH, which is just the amount it takes to have sort of a validator slot on the beacon chain. From there, Eth2 clients are essentially a light client of this smart contract. So then that's how this deposit data gets into the new system. And then once you're there, you go through like a sort of queuing phase, and then eventually you are activated as a validator, and you're ready to go. Yeah, so hardware requirements, the intention is to keep it as light as possible. I think a lot of the ways that we're approaching this in terms of implementation is that there's the beacon node. Separately, there'll be validator clients themselves, which are actually even lighter weight than a beacon node, essentially just like reading the beacon chain state and then figuring out when they have different responsibilities to the network.
Yeah, a small sorry.
Oh, yeah. Regarding hardware requirement, I will be giving a talk at DEF CON on Ethereum 2 on Raspberry Pi. So it should work at least on a Raspberry Pi. And there should be also an announcement regarding the sometime soon for the Ethereum 1 deposit contract to transfer Ethereum 1 Ether to Ethereum 2.
Yeah. The infrastructure we're also designed to set up so that you can have the validator client as a separate piece of software that just does the signing, compared to the node that does all of the processing, which this thing should be able to run on a very light Raspberry Pi, and this thing can be some server somewhere else. So you should be able to run it very cheaply. Yeah, so to become a validator, to stake Ether and to go, participate in the proof of stake system, you can run very, very light software as long as it can communicate with something that runs a little bit more, the actual node itself.
And there is also a team that is doing a JavaScript client, so I guess they will target the browser.
And then I guess for the final question, which is maybe a little inside baseball, but I think we'll be able to answer it with the time remaining. Why ETH2 and Plasma? Like, what is it that Ethereum 2 does or claims to provide that Plasma sidechains wouldn't be able to provide in terms of scalability?
So it's not like a disjunction, like one or the other. Like generally the approach is both. So you can have, let's say you have Ethereum today, which is just this not scalable layer 1. Then there's this idea to have Plasma, which is essentially our layer 2 systems on top. We're just saying, like, why not both? You scale layer 1, and on top of that, you could have scalable Plasmas on top.
Yeah, multiplicative scaling.
Yes, yes, exactly. So the best of both worlds.
Part of it too is that we might not necessarily know like what makes sense and what is the right way to achieve the different application patterns and like dApp designs that people will have, right? So the more optionality we have, probably the better, given how early everything is.
Yeah. Do you think that that's a risk to Ethereum 2 that maybe in the interim, like maybe during phase 1, Plasma chains just provide this enormous scaling benefit and then momentum is lost? Do you think that that's a risk?
I don't think it's a risk. So generally there's like a pretty strong drive to move towards, for example, at least a proof of stake system. So like it's not that we'd like somehow have like this scaling data layer on phase 1 that then lets us do like really nice Plasma stuff on the proof of work chain, and then everyone's like, oh, actually we don't need to like do phase 2. A lot of it too is that sure you have scaling, but there are also like known issues, say with the EVM, and so phase 2 gives us a chance to like improve that part of things.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention when we wrap up that, like as you were saying before, Mamy, about standards across blockchains, WebAssembly has become sort of the de facto VM standard for all the blockchain projects that I'm aware of. I think everyone is either rolling their own language, which requires their own VM, or they're trying to support, even some of those people are trying to support WebAssembly as well. And there has been an attempt to support WebAssembly in ETH1, which has successes, but is not. Actually, I think I don't know if Parity support.
Yeah, Parity support what they call the P WebAssembly. So you can use that today from Parity.
Yeah, so it's still coming. All right. Well, I would like to thank the one audience question and the panelists for speaking here. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.